Hi, my name is Michael Tillman, and today I will be presenting on the proposed Morro Bay offshore wind farm and its impacts on northern elephant seal migration. As society becomes increasingly aware of human-induced climate change, its effects on the global biosphere, and the ways in which anthropogenic impacts can be mitigated, governments around the world are starting to set ambitious goals to decrease their carbon emissions by utilizing more renewable forms of energy, like solar and wind. Within a few years, the global amount of energy from installed offshore wind energy facilities rose from 4,334 megawatts to a total of 18,814 megawatts in 2017. This number is forecasted to reach 120 gigawatts by 2030, considering the recent radical expansion of design and construction of commercial-scale offshore wind energy facilities. Offshore wind energy facilities have been constructed in many different forms, including fixed turbines that are driven into the sea floor in less than 60 meters of water, to floating turbines which are moored in 120 meters of water. Now, investigations have begun on the potential of floating turbines moored in about 1,000 meters of water, which has been incentivized by accessing more intense and consistent wind speeds offshore, adopting existing infrastructure from the offshore oil and gas industry, and reducing impacts on human activities in marine ecosystems. So location and why it matters. With the construction of these floating OWFs, or offshore wind facilities, potential conflicts with local migrating organisms like northern elephant seals arise. Northern elephant seals haul out twice a year to breed and to molt. During the breeding season, adult males start appearing on the beaches towards the end of November, while adult females start showing up during December and continue to arrive until February. The adult males will not leave the rookery until the last female has left, which usually happens in March. The pups that were born on the beach during this time embark on their first trip to sea by April. Once at sea, males head north and west to forage along the continental shelf, while females head northwest to the open sea for foraging. After foraging at sea, northern elephant seals return to land to molt. Females and juveniles come back to the rookery during the spring, while subadult and adult males return in the summer to molt. Since the Morro Bay call area will be located about 48 kilometers offshore from the Piedras Blancas rookery, as seen in the left picture, the concern is that floating OWFs will impact elephant seals when they are heading out to sea and returning to land, as seen in the right picture. In the right picture, there's a little red dot, and that's the Piedras Blancas rookery on the coast of California. Just offshore of that, you'll see a beige area, and that's where the Morro Bay proposed offshore wind farm is supposed to be located. Those green tiles indicate the amount of activity of northern elephant seals. So if it's darker green, it means that there's more northern elephant seals in that tile. And you can see that northern elephant seal migration will run right through the proposed Morro Bay offshore wind farm. So potential impacts on marine mammals. We analyzed 3 potential impacts: electromagnetic fields, noise, and structural. Our questions that we asked were, will the floating OWFs emit an electromagnetic field great enough to disturb or reroute northern elephant seals? Can the noise emitted from the floating OWFs during construction and operating be great enough to harm or reroute northern elephant seals? And will the structural composure of the floating OWFs impede northern elephant seal movement and or possibly damage them? So moving on, the first impact we looked at was the electromagnetic field impact. The Earth has its own naturally occurring geomagnetic field. However, adding additional anthropogenic electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, can disrupt marine organisms. Many marine animals, such as marine mammals, use the Earth's geomagnetic field for orientation, navigation, and hunting. These anthropogenic EMFs have the potential to alter marine animals' ability to survive, reproduce, and migrate. There's little understanding of how animals will respond to EMFs generated from marine renewable energy devices, or MREDs. Most likely, EMFs generated from cables connecting MREDs will either cause an attraction or avoidance reaction from marine mammals. The EMFs emitted from a wind turbine are substantially lower than the EMFs emitted from the connecting cables. Specifically, the cables that export power to shore had greater EMFs than the cables connecting the turbines together. Thompson et al. Studied multiple export and connecting cables and found that the EMFs generated were in the known detectable region for receptor species that are sensitive to EMFs. However, the EMFs were at the lower end of the detection spectrum. Alternating current, or AC, power cables are the industry standard for constructing MREDs. Normandeau et al. Tested 10 AC cables and found that 8 of the cables displayed fields that were proportional to the voltage on the cables. The modeling magnetic field for these cables tended to be strongest directly above the cables and then quickly dissipated as distance increased from the cables, as seen in the figure on the left. Although both AC and direct current cables, or DC cables, can have an induced electric field from movement through their respective magnetic fields, the polarity of the induced electric field from an organism or current moving through an AC magnetic field will reverse at the same frequency, thus diminishing the effects of this induced field. Low-intensity magnetic fields emitted from AC cables are in the range of microtesla to picotesla, which are predicted to be not sensed by magnetite-based organisms such as marine mammals. Low-intensity AC fields may only be sensed within a few meters and will therefore most likely only impose long-term effects on organisms that stay in close proximity to the cables. Even though AC cables are standard for MREDs, floating OWFs may need to deploy DC cables in order to export power over greater distances. If DC cables are deployed, the risk of EMF interference may be greater because the magnetic field emitted from a DC cable is much greater than that of an AC cable. Normandeau et al. Also found that bottlenose dolphins exhibited behavior changes in low-intensity magnetic fields ranging as low as 0.05 microtesla. Modeling suggests that these bottlenose dolphins can detect the magnetic field from up to 50 meters or more from the cable, and thus may experience alterations in their navigation. Although marine mammals may experience alterations in navigation within the magnetic field, it is likely that they will be able to reorientate and correct their navigational path once outside of the field. So now moving on to the electromagnetic field discussion. Northern elephant seals use visual cues to navigate long distances while at the surface, but they appear to be using some sort of other mechanism for navigation while diving. Geomagnetic cues appears to be the seal's main mode of navigation when visual cues are not present. If northern elephant seals use geomagnetic cues for navigation, then EMFs from interconnecting power cables may disrupt their migration. Most MREDs deploy AC power cables. If the Morro Bay call area follows MRED standards, then northern elephant seals may only exhibit minor behavioral changes within 5 meters of the cable. However, if DC cables are deployed for the Morro Bay call area, northern elephant seals may experience alterations in navigation within 50 meters of the cable, as seen in the bottlenose dolphin case study. Once outside of the magnetic field of these cables, it is expected that the northern elephant seal will be able to reorientate and resume on their migrational path. It may be possible that the seals avoid the magnetic field altogether and move around the Morro Bay call area instead. Northern elephant seals will most likely only experience minor behavioral changes in response to anthropogenic EMS, and AC power cables should be deployed in the Morro Bay call area in order to minimize these behavioral changes. Now moving on to noise impacts. Anthropogenic noise pollution has the potential to negatively impact marine organisms, especially those who rely on sound and sonar to forage, communicate, and interact with their environment. Certain magnitudes and frequencies of noise could potentially cause hearing loss in marine organisms and/or displace them from the source if the noise persists. Operational noise from existing fixed bottom OWFs are low in frequency and should not pose any risk to marine mammals since they typically only use high-frequency sounds to navigate. Operational noise measured at the Isle of Wight tidal turbine site ranged from 1 to 2.5 kilohertz next to the turbines, and from 10 to 15 decibels higher than ambient conditions, 282 meters from the turbine. Sound levels approximately 500 meters from the turbine are expected to approach ambient levels. Operational noise from floating OWFs should emit similar frequencies and thus would have a low impact on marine mammals. Other sources of noise pollution from OWFs are generated from vessel traffic and underwater construction required to install, maintain, and decommission offshore wind turbines. These more impactful activities are relatively short-lived and could be scheduled to avoid construction during major migration events to further mitigate the effects on marine mammals. The most disruptive and loudest noise levels in offshore construction projects come from installation and pile driving the supports into the ocean floor. Tugard et al. Examined the anthropogenic sound pollution from the construction and operation of an offshore wind farm in Horns Reef, located in the North Sea, and concluded that harbor porpoises were displaced during the construction of the pilings for the wind farm, but returned after a period of a few hours. The operation sound of the Horns Reef offshore wind farm turbines appeared to have no effects on the harbor porpoises. However, the floating wind turbines proposed off the coast of San Simeon will generate less noise during construction than installing full-size pilings required for shallower offshore wind turbines or other industrial projects like oil rigs, since floating turbines only require much smaller pilings or anchors to be placed on the sea floor. Now moving on to noise impact discussion. In addition to potentially using geomagnetic cues to navigate when visual cues are absent, northern elephant seals may be using their well-developed facial vibrissae and ears to detect sound cues for navigation and foraging in low light conditions. Operational noises of OWFs are low in frequency, as seen from operational noises at the Isle of Wight, and pose little risk to disrupting or damaging northern elephant seal sound detection, since marine mammals detect frequencies that are higher than the operational frequency of OWFs. The greatest risk for anthropogenic noise comes from construction of the OWFs. It is likely that northern elephant seals will be displaced or will avoid the Morro Bay call area altogether during construction, but may return once construction is completed, as seen with the harbor porpoises in Horns Reef. However, the anthropogenic noise emitted from the construction of the floating OWFs in the Morro Bay call area will emit a much lower frequency than that of the OWFs located in Horns Reef, since floating OWFs do not require large pilings to be driven into the sea floor. Despite this, construction of the OWFs should be avoided or halted during large migration events and exhibited by northern elephant seals. Moving on to structural impediments impacts. There is cause for concern with the deployment of a floating OWF because it is a foreign obstacle that may result in entanglement or collisions with migrating marine mammals. Deep water floating OWFs require mooring systems to be anchored to the sea floor instead of using pilings. Thus, entanglement risk of marine mammals will depend on the type of mooring system deployed by the OWF. The proposed floating OWS for the CWO plan will the proposed floating OWS for the Morro Bay call area will use either slack or taut mooring systems to anchor the turbine to the seafloor. Taut moored systems seem to pose the least amount of risk for entanglement because they will move through the water column, less than if they had slack. However, taut moored systems will still pose some levels of risk since they will be too strong for animals to break free from in case of entanglement. Anthropogenic materials such as fishing gear pose the greatest potential cause for entanglement of marine mammals. Therefore, it is more likely that marine mammals are at risk of secondary entanglement in which fishing gear becomes attached to MREDs and continues to fish. Similar risk factors may apply to the power cables interconnecting each turbine. Typically, these cables are buried beneath the sediment. However, developers may deem this impractical given the depth of the water column in which the proposed Morro Bay call area is planned for. Instead, developers may opt to use subsurface buoys to submerge these cables in the water column. This method would pose additional entanglement or secondary entanglement risk to marine mammals. Considering the large spatial distribution of floating OWS, the overall risk for entanglement and collisions is low. If you look at this picture here, This picture displays the different types of possible offshore wind farm turbines. The one in the middle, called semi-submersible, you can see that the mooring system, and also with the spar one on the far right, the mooring systems that is attached to the platform are slack mooring systems because the ropes have some room to sway, versus that tension leg platform on the one on the left is taut mooring systems, since the ropes do not have room to sway. You can see how the semi-submersible and the spar system would have room for possibly more entanglements, or be easier to encourage secondary entanglements from fishing gear that gets caught on the line. This picture here shows how ideally the Morro Bay call area will display their interconnecting power cables. Ideally, from each turbine, the cables will go straight down to the sea floor and then connect to the other turbine, and then go back straight down to the sea floor and move to the power plant. However, if the cables are submerged by buoys, it would look more like this, where the cables are not all the way down to the seafloor, or instead in the middle of the water column, connecting each turbine together, and then going directly to the seafloor from a substation to the power station. And you can see in this picture how it would pose a similar entanglement risk to the slack mooring systems instead of the taut mooring systems when having submerged power cables. So in conclusion, EMF effects should pose low to minimal magnitude impacts on marine mammals. Noise effects should also pose low to minimal impacts on marine mammals, and structural impediments might pose a medium impact on marine mammals. Construction during large migration events of this wind turbine should be avoided. Taut mooring systems should be used instead of slack mooring systems, and power cables should be embedded on the sea floor instead of being submerged by buoys, in order to pose the least amount of impacts on marine mammals. AC cables should also be deployed instead of DC power cables in order to reduce the effects of EMF effects on marine mammals and northern elephant seals. Here are my references, and thank you for watching.